Hi, good afternoon. I'm Rob Guttrow from NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center in the Office of Communications, also manager of the NASA Hurricane page. We're here today for an HS3 Google Hangout. HS3 means Hurricane and Severe Storm Sentinel Google Hangout. The HS3 mission is a 5-year mission. This is the second year of the mission, and we'll be finding out what's brand new for this year with our 4 panelists. Just a little bit about the HS3 mission. The HS3 mission's purpose is to investigate the processes that underlie hurricane formation and the intensity changes of tropical cyclones in the Atlantic Ocean. Among those factors, HS3 will address the controversial hot, dry, and dusty Saharan air layer in tropical storm formation and intensification, and the extent to which the deep convection of the inner core of those storms is the key driver of intensity change. The HS3 mission will run between August 20th and September 23rd, based at Wallops Flight Facility in Wallops Island, Virginia. The HS3 mission page is nasa.gov/HS3. We will be taking questions at the end of the Hangout, and you can make some comments and questions in the YouTube comment section, on Twitter at #NASAHS3, and also on the Google Plus page. Our participants today include Dr. Scott Brown. He is the principal investigator. Tom Miller, a NASA Global Hawk pilot, live from the airplane hangar at Dryden, so you'll be able to see the Global Hawk behind him. Marilyn Vasquez, the HS3 project manager, and our guest Brian McNulty, a senior research associate at the University of Miami's Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences, and a Capital Weather Gang columnist. So we're going to start the Google Hangout by going over to Dr. Scott Brown. He's a research meteorologist here at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, and he studies hurricanes from the inside and out. He was the HS3 principal mission investigator last year and again this year. He leads a diverse team of scientists and instrument specialists to investigate hurricanes and conduct experiments using unmanned aircraft to better understand the conditions that favor the storm formation and the development of major hurricanes. And here's Dr. Scott Brown to talk about what's new with the HS3 mission this year and the science behind it. Scott?
Okay, thanks, Rob. Well, as Rob said, we're studying the processes that affect storm formation and intensity change, and we're particularly interested in the relative roles of the large-scale environment and inner core processes. And that, in terms of the environment, one of the things we're particularly interested in is the Saharan air layer, which has been controversial of late. There's been a number of studies early on that suggest that it can have a positive influence on storm growth, and that it aids storm formation and intensification, and a number of studies that suggest that it actually has an inhibiting effect on storm intensification. In addition, we're very interested in what happens in the inner core, in particular with very deep thunderstorms, also called hot towers. And some studies have suggested that when these hot towers are seen within the eye wall of a hurricane, the storm is more likely to undergo intensification in the day that follows, whereas if a tower is not seen, they tend either not to intensify or to weaken. But it's still not clear whether these hot towers are playing an active key role in the development, or if they're maybe more of a passive indicator of other processes that are leading to the intensification. And so HS3 was really designed to try and look at both the environmental aspect of the problem and the inner core part of the problem. And to do that, we're using 2 of the NASA unmanned aircraft, one equipped specifically to look at the environment, and I'll describe a little later the payload that's on there, and the other is equipped with the payload to really look at the inner core, in particular the precipitation and winds within the eye wall and the rain bands. Last year was our first deployment, and in that deployment out of Wallops, we only had the environmental aircraft, and that was partly due to some logistical and technical issues with the other aircraft. Excuse me, your bud just fell out. But it proved extremely useful having that one aircraft to work out a number of the issues involved in a very complex operation, operating out of Wallops for the very first time, with a Global Hawk, with a science team that had never done this type of campaign in just this sort of way. So it was really a challenge. We had 6 flights that were done last year. The first one was actually our transit flight from Dryden out to Wallops. Hurricane Leslie was out in the Western Atlantic at the time, and we decided to fly around the outskirts of Leslie to look at its outflow layer. And that was our very first flight, and we got some very unique observations of the outflow layer probably for the first time, from above the storm all the way through the outflow layer and down to the surface. Our next 5 flights were into a very long-lived Hurricane Nadine, which the first flight being when it first became a tropical storm, the second flight when it first became a hurricane, and then if you remember, Hurricane Nadine moved out into the eastern Atlantic around the Azores and just sort of meandered out there for almost 2 weeks, or about 2 weeks. And we were able to do 3 flights during that time, something that you really wouldn't be able to do with the manned aircraft because of the range and duration of the Global Hawk. And during that time, we saw the weakening of the storm when it went post-tropical, and then we saw its redevelopment, including the onset of its re-intensification back into a hurricane, and it subsequently reached its maximum intensity over its entire life cycle. So we got some very unique measurements last year. Now this year we're adding in the second aircraft, which will have the suite of instruments designed to look at the inner core, and by using the 2 planes, potentially one right after the other, we'll be able to get snapshots of the environment. I shouldn't say snapshots, but continuous looks at the environment and then the inner core, and then potentially going back and forth between the 2, with time in between for crew rest, given the long duration of these flights. Rob, if you guys want to show the interactive on the instruments, I can talk a little bit about the payload, or we can pause a moment and discuss that later.
Okay, let's pull up the interactive, please. All right, as we wait for the interactive, the unmanned aircraft will actually be able to go for twice as long as the Hurricane Hunter aircraft. Is that correct, Scott?
A lot of its total flight duration is 2 to 3 times as long as a typical manned aircraft. Depending on where the storm is in the Atlantic, will either be, if it's close to the U.S., we'll be able to spend maybe 2 to 3 times as much time over the storm as you would with a manned aircraft. But if it's out in the central Atlantic, we can actually get the storms that we wouldn't normally get to with manned aircraft because of the long range. And Nadine was a good example of that, where it was in the northeastern Atlantic, and we were able to spend 10 to 12 hours over the storm, whereas a manned aircraft really would not have been able to get to it and spend any time at all in it. So that is a real advantage of the aircraft.
And this year we're actually going to be double teaming with the 2 Global Hawks. One to get the data from the guts of the storm, and the other basically to look at the whole environment of the storm. So that's something we weren't able to do last year.
Right. Is that interactive ready? I can see it down below.
We are bringing the interactive up. Let's take let's turn to some of the instruments on the Global Hawks as we wait for the interactive to come up.
Well, that's what I was hoping for the interactive for. But
okay.
One thing we can say is, as we're doing these flights, we're interacting quite a bit with NOAA. NOAA is one of our team members. They provide one of the instruments, and the sort of the manpower behind operating the instrument and processing the data. In addition, they're providing a few of the pilots and some of the ground crews, so they're a significant partner for us. In addition to that, the NOAA Hurricane Hunter aircraft and Air Force Hurricane Hunter aircraft will be out there at the same time, and we are planning to collaborate with them as much as possible to try to time our flights so that we're either flying together to maximize the data being collected at any one time, or to fly in series with each other so that we maintain as continuous a coverage of the storm as we possibly can. So if the interactive is not going to be up, I can just go ahead.
It's up and running. You just look on the bottom of your screen there.
All right. So this is our environmental aircraft. It has 3 instruments on it for 2013. The first is the Cloud Physics LiDAR, which is up in the nose of the aircraft. It's specifically designed to look at profiles of Saharan dust, which is one of the things that we're trying to track and how it interacts with the storm. So this gives us a way to identify where the Saharan air layer air mass is. A second instrument in the belly of the aircraft, although it lists twilight there, that's one that we're not actually flying this year, but there's another instrument that's going to be there called Scanning His, or it's an interferometer sounder that'll give us vertical profiles of temperature and humidity in the clear air environment. And then when we're overflying clouds, it gives us information on the properties of the cloud tops. And then at the back of the aircraft, there's an instrument known as AVAPS, which is a dropson system. So it releases a small tube from the aircraft that floats down to the surface on a parachute, and as it's going down, it collects information on temperature, humidity, pressure, wind speed, and direction with very high vertical resolution. So we get very detailed measurements of some of the vertical structures. And that's one of the instruments that we also then can feed in to some of the operational centers and potentially into some of the forecast models. Now, we had also planned to fly a wind LiDAR that would have been in the belly of the aircraft that would provide continuous wind speed and direction measurements in the clear air, but there's been some issues with that we haven't been able to fly it yet. I guess I won't get into that part. If you can go to the other aircraft, our Overstorm aircraft is carrying the Plan 3 instruments, which are Hamster in the nose of the aircraft. It's a microwave sounder that's capable of giving us sort of low-resolution vertical profiles of temperature and humidity in both clear and cloudy air. And then when we're in precipitating areas, it gives us information on the vertical precipitation profiles. In the belly of the aircraft is a dual-frequency conically scanning Doppler radar. So this provides information on both wind speed and direction and precipitation profiles within the storm. And then when we're outside of precipitation areas, it can give us wind speed and direction at the surface to look at the overall surface flow. And then in the tail of the aircraft is an instrument that's a microwave radiometer that gives us a broad swath of surface wind speed and precipitation information. So in one pass of the storm, we'll be able to map out the surface wind speed field and look at the structure of the wind maximum, how broad the wind speed maximum is, and things of that sort. Now this year, it's not on the interactive diagram, but we're also flying what we call a piggyback instrument, something that got itself funded to ride along with us, and it's a gamma ray detector looking at gamma rays emitted from lightning within the storm. So those are the instruments that we have for this year. Back to you, Rob.
Thank you, Scott. Just a reminder, we are taking questions, and you can make comments or questions on YouTube. You can make them on Twitter using hashtag NASA HS3, and also comments will be taken on the Google Plus page. And we will get to your questions and answers at the end of the session. Now I'd like to move on to NASA Dryden and to Tom Miller, a project pilot for the Global Hawk, who is sitting in the hangar with the Global Hawk behind him. Tom Miller is a project pilot for the unmanned spacecraft at Edwards, California, and he determines training objectives and standards. He evaluates aircrew performance, and he is a subject matter expert for development on the ground station and command and control communication system that's used to fly the aircraft. So Tom, tell us about the aircraft operational.
Okay, well, I'll begin with a description of the airplane itself and let everybody get a look at the whole thing here. This is actually Air Vehicle 1. This was the aircraft that Ryan first flew, the first Global Hawk to fly back in 1998. So we resurrected it for a NASA science mission, and it's still going strong. We As Scott talked about there, we develop our mission plans in conjunction with the scientists, typically a couple days prior to the flight. We'll go ahead and start working with the science team, and up to about the day prior, where we'll finalize this and turn it into a flight plan. Then we'll also, on that day, we'll also be coordinating with the air traffic authorities and lining up everything to conduct the mission. The day of flight, we'll show up about 3 hours prior to flight time, do our briefing, do our pre-flights, and prepare the aircraft. During all the time this is going on, the ground crew has been working really hard getting the aircraft ready to go. So we'll conduct the pre-flight, and then we go ahead and launch the aircraft using local command and control links. About 3 hours after the launch, we'll be driving out to the mission area. We'll go ahead and hand off the aircraft back to a crew here at Dryden that's in our Global Hawk Operations Center. And they will take over the aircraft and either continue en route to the mission area, depending on how close the mission area is, or go ahead and start right into the science portion. This crew will do a shift of about 9 to 10 hours. They'll hand it off to another crew, who again does another 9 or 10 hours of doing the scientists, and again we'll either continue that, or depending on where the storm is, we'll start to drive home. Approximately 4 hours prior to landing, they'll hand the aircraft back off to the crew at Wallops, the recovery crew, and that crew will then effect the join up with the chase aircraft and go ahead and land. So as far as how the airplane flies, it's very similar to flying any other airplane, just kind of a full-time autopilot. We drive the airplane around and work with the scientists to achieve whatever objectives they need to accomplish. And again, the mission depends on whether we're flying the overstorm aircraft or the environmental aircraft as to how complicated it is. Let's see. What else can I talk about here about the airplane? Some of the challenges that we talked about and the advantages. Obviously, one of the advantages of using an unmanned aircraft is that we do have the endurance. We don't have to carry a full crew. We swap out during the flight. So that's a big advantage that this aircraft offers, whereas a manned aircraft is typically limited to the endurance of the air crew. We can change ours out right in the middle of the mission. But this also brings some challenges in that it is an unmanned aircraft, and we're still trying to fully integrate in the airspace with the other manned aircraft. So that's proved to be a challenge, but we've got a really good relationship with the FAA and the Oceanic Control Authorities, and they've really helped us out a lot. We've come a long way in a very short time on this program. To continue doing that.
Thank you, Tom. So I have a question for you. In terms of the duration of Global Hawks, how long can they stay in the air?
Well, of course, this depends on how the aircraft is loaded, but general flight time is about 28 hours.
And what altitude do they fly at?
We'll go well above 60,000 feet. We get to a cruise climb altitude based on weight, and at that point we have to burn off more fuel to continue climbing. So it achieves an initial altitude and then just does this kind of slow climb up to the ultimate ceiling.
So what is it like piloting the Global Hawk from where you are?
Well, it's a little strange. In some cases, you're a little disconnected from the aircraft. You don't have the same sensations that you would in a manned aircraft. You don't have, sound, the sound of the aircraft, the sound of the engines, the seat of the pants sensations, the G-forces that come on an airplane when you're flying. You know, if something were to go wrong, for example, and the engine were to roll back, you don't hear that as you would in a manned aircraft. So that brings its own challenges. Basically, all we have is sight, what's projected on the computer screen. So it's a bit like flying any other aircraft but on a full-time autopilot. We don't have direct control over the flight controls, but we give the aircraft altitude, headings, and airspeeds, and the mission management computers decide how to get the airplane where we asked it to go.
And at 60,000 feet, you're well over the top of a tropical storm.
Generally, we are, yes.
So last year, I understand that during Hurricane Nadine, we dropped somewhere in the vicinity of 300 dropsons. Is that correct? So that provided a lot of information that we otherwise couldn't get.
Yeah, it sure did. I think Scott could speak more to the data that was collected than I could.
Yeah, I think overall we collected about 350 dropson profiles. The dropson instrument's capable of carrying up to 88 sons in a single flight. I think the most that we did was around 75, 77 last year in a single flight.
Scott, can you explain for the viewers what a dropson is and what it tells us?
Yeah, I thought I did earlier, but so basically, again, it's a small tube that has a parachute at one end and a sensor at the other end, and it's ejected from the aircraft. It's a fairly lightweight tube, about maybe 1.5 inches in diameter and maybe 15 inches long. And as it falls to the surface on this small parachute, it's collecting temperature, pressure, wind speed, relative humidity, and wind direction. And then when it hits the surface, it stops collecting data. But it basically gives us a very high resolution profile of those parameters at the location of the drop.
Thank you, Scott. Back to you, Tom. Anything you want to add?
I don't think so. Maybe I'll save it for some questions and answers later. Give
Okay.
everyone a chance.
Very good. Thank you. And that's a beautiful aircraft behind you. Again, just a reminder for those who are watching us on YouTube or on Google+, you can comment on both of those, and also on Twitter with hashtag NASA HS3. Next, we're going to take you to Marilyn Vasquez. She's the HS3 project manager, and she has been leading more than 200 people who will be involved in preparing and supporting the aircraft. So she's going to tell us what it takes to get the flight off the ground. Marilyn does flight planning and aircraft coordination, and she conducts the science data collection, which is a big job all in itself. All of this work is done to support the HS3 mission, which has the 2 Global Hawks, as we've been talking about, and carry these science instruments over hurricanes and tropical cyclones. So, Marilyn, tell us about flight planning and what it takes to get a flight off the ground.
All right. Getting some echo here. Anyway, I wanted to let you know that this whole project is a great amount of coordination, communication, and planning. That's how we do this. I work the project development with Scott, and then with the Global Hawk team at Dryden for all of the operations, and then also with our hosts here at Wallops for the logistics and operations for flying the plane. So do you have that? Yes, I see you've got the integration video. Can we run that? So what I'm showing you here, if it comes up, are you guys seeing it? Anyway, it's the integration of the environmental aircraft. You're going to see them scanning HIS into the belly of the plane, then CPL into the nose, and AVAPS, which that was the dropson system, they'll be loading that into the tail. So you can watch that while I tell you a little bit about how we do a mission. So for example, when the instruments first arrive, the first thing we do is we weigh them. Then we hook them up to a ground computer that's going to communicate and find out if the instrument is properly communicating, because we want to have the status of the instruments while they're flying. We want it to be able to talk to us on the ground. We also want to plug it in and see what kind of power it's going to draw. So we want to have a very good characterization of the plane, of the instruments before we put them on the plane. So once we've done that with all the instruments, we put them all on the plane, we attach all the fairings, get the whole plane ready as if it's going to fly, then we weigh it. That gives us the center of gravity for the calculations that we need for fuel load. After that, we're getting ready for communication testing. So what we want to do at that point is make sure that the scientists who will be at the facility, the operations facility at Wallops, they'll be able to talk to their instruments. And the instruments at that time are on the plane, on the ground at Dryden. So that's our first test. Then we do a series of other communication tests to make sure everything's going to run. when we're very confident that everything is communicating, whether it be a science instrument or a facility instrument, which would be things like a camera or the basic communication system for the plane, once all that is working, then we're ready for a test flight. So at that point, we fly the plane in the area right around Dryden to make sure that all the instruments are working well, communicate well. They fly for about 5 hours, and at that point, we're ready for a transit flight. So we are at that point. We're not quite at that point yet. We're right now for HS3 2013. We have. Sorry, I keep seeing Rob, so I'm distracted. I'm not seeing the video. Sorry, Rob. So there, that's better. Anyway, no offense, Rob. But anyway, so when we transit the airplane, and we'll do that the week of August 2nd, we'll transit both the airplanes. Right now, in the process of that, what I described to you, we are at the point where the instruments have all been loaded on the plane. We've done weight and balance, and we've done the beginning of the communications test. So soon we'll be ready for the range test, and then we'll start planning our transit. So this whole operation is very complicated. There's a very large infrastructure at Dryden for supporting the airplane. But as you can imagine, we have to do the same thing at Wallops. So we work with our colleagues here to be sure we have a hangar, we have the proper fuel, we have the proper ground support equipment. Tom was talking about in the plane taking off on the runway. We have to realize, since there isn't a pilot, the pilot can't see if there is an obstruction on the runway for any reason. So we have a truck that goes alongside the plane when it's on the runway to be sure that there's no obstructions before it takes off. So all those things have to be coordinated. We have space for the scientists, space for the all the different instruments. We have labs for them. We have so many people involved. It is very complex to set it all up. We need to get them badged. We need to make sure they all know how to work safely around an airplane. We lay out an evacuation plan way in advance so that we're, in case a storm comes our way, we know how to get the planes and the people out safely. All that is involved in the initial planning. Then we get ready to actually plan a particular flight. So Scott's told you about our goals. Well, we have the goals, then we have what the nature has put out as our targets. Do we have a storm out there that's going to it looks like it's developing? Do we have one that looks like it's going to intensify? Which one's closer? Which one should we choose? Which plane should we choose? And we have to do this 48 hours in advance. We have to have a flight plan. So we have to think about what we want to do, and do we want to fly with those other groups, the NOAA and Air Force aircraft that Scott mentioned? Do we want to have them in the storm while we're going back and getting another plane? How do we want to do it? And we talk to them, to the whole group, once a day, to look at our planning to see what we want to do. All those things have to come together. They have to
Hey, Rob, I think we lost her feed from Wallops.
Okay, it looks like we may have lost Marilyn. We're getting a lot of great questions, which we will begin to address. First, I would like to go over to our guest, Brian McNulty. He's a senior research associate at the University of Miami's Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences in Miami. He's a tropical weather expert, too, for the Washington Post's Capital Weather Gang blog. Some cool things about Brian is that he actually spent a summer here at NASA Goddard in 1997, so he got to see the trim spacecraft and meet one of his role models, Joanne Simpson, who he calls the mother of tropical meteorology. Most of his current research is on vortex initialization in models, and it's about analyzing a model and creating a new vortex that hopefully more closely resembles nature. So, Brian, why don't we just jump over to you and see if you have any questions for the panel, and go from there.
All right. Thanks, Rob. I appreciate the invitation to be on here with the experts from HS3 program. Yeah, the work being done by this is incredible. Being able to go out to the far eastern Atlantic and look at storms is certainly a unique opportunity. The manned aircraft at best can get out to about the mid-Atlantic, and that's a stretch. So this is really an incredible opportunity, and it's really great to see that we have year after year of this. So anyway, so then this is year number 2. So we'll see what sort of storms we can get this year. As far as questions go, I guess maybe my first one would be for Tom. Now you mentioned we can fly one of the Global Hawks at a time. We can fly one of the Global Hawks at a time, and those can be in coordination with either a NOAA or an Air Force plane, so they could be flying through the same storm or on top of the same storm at the same time.
Yeah, that's true. However, remember, these aircraft are typically going to be at different altitudes. Obviously,
sure.
we're the high flyers out there, and then the other aircraft will be in. But we do have a pretty good communications plan. This is something we've been working on for a long time. In fact, it's been years in development. We've been NASA and NOAA have been doing hurricane research for a long time. So that's key, as Marilyn said, is the coordination between all of these different agencies. So we have this plan that we use, and we follow the plan. Okay, my apologies. The network kicked me off there for a second. So.
Okay, no problem.
So we follow this plan pretty closely to make sure that everybody is not in the same airspace at the same time, and we're not dropping things in a place where we won't want to drop them. So
right.
That's the key there. And Marilyn does a really good job corralling everybody together and keeping us on this plan to make sure that we're following.
Terrific. So yeah, I guess one thing to just, if anyone is curious, these planes don't replace what we have now in terms of the manned missions that fly right into the eye of a hurricane and measure the maximum winds and all that. So these are just kind of a really great extra resource. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's true, Brian, and that's really the same for any aircraft. All aircraft are good at doing certain things, and really the key is combining all of these aircraft together and using the advantages of each of them. It provides a lot of synergy for the whole project as a whole.
Absolutely, yeah, it's wonderful. And being able to go out and get the wind fields from storms in the far eastern Atlantic is something we've never been able to do. And then, again, the big push on being able to understand the dry air coming off of Africa, these Saharan air layers, is a huge mystery. What impact that has on hurricanes and how fast they strengthen, or if they strengthen at all. There's some proof that the Saharan air layer can actually help storms, and some on the flip side that it's not so good for them. Maybe a question then for Scott would be, what happens to these instruments after HS3 is over? Obviously, there's some great instruments at work here. Do they just get retired, or what's their future?
No, they won't be retired. All these instruments are generally funded through various research programs. So right now they're committed to HS3 for 3 years of flights. When this is done, they'll likely be trying to get funding for additional support for other campaigns. For example, HS3 was funded under the first round of NASA's Earth Venture suborbital call back in 2009. And right now they're going through the process of getting new proposals, and next year they'll make selections for a new round. And so it's possible that some of these instruments will get funded for other projects, whether it's hurricanes, winter storms, maybe more climate and chemistry. Well, these wouldn't be necessary for climate and chemistry. Some of them might be. But basically, they're tied to opportunities for funding. And so it's kind of hard to say what will happen next for a lot of these instruments, other than that they'll eventually find their way into another project somewhere.
All right, and speaking of that, is there ever, have you guys kind of put on the wish list being able to have a global hawk in the long term for hurricane recon?
Well, with NASA, with HS3, again, it's only funded for the 5 years, and there's no real plan for the long term within NASA as regular reconnaissance, since we're more research oriented rather than operationally oriented. However, we are having some discussions with NOAA. NOAA has a very deep interest in using the aircraft for both hurricanes and winter storms, and there are some discussions at high levels about trying to make at least one of the aircraft, or maybe both, available to NOAA, contingent upon being able to work out some of the funding issues.
Terrific. All right, I think that's my main questions right now. Thank you, guys.
All right, thank you, Brian. We have quite a number of reporter questions and questions from Google, YouTube, and Twitter. The first question is from Carrie Rose, and Carrie has addressed to Scott. Scott, she would like you to restate which piggyback instrument is being added to the Overstorm aircraft.
Well, the acronym for the instrument is ADELE, A-D-E-L-E. I can't off the top of my head remember what the acronym stands for, but it's a gamma ray detector. So basically, it's looking for gamma rays that are emitted from lightning at the top of the storm. Well, the gamma rays are emitted from the top of the storm, and so they're relatively rare events, but this was an opportunity for them to get on a high-altitude aircraft where they might be readily able to see these types of phenomena.
And Adele is not named after the pop singer who sang Skyfall, by the way. And by the way, we're getting a lot of questions about whether or not HS3 will see a Sharknado, and the answer to that is no. So for everybody who sent out that question, we could just move on from there.
No, Sharknadoes occur on too small of a scale.
Thank you, Scott. Another reported question. This question is, how do the instruments on HS3 compare to the instruments that are already in use by satellites?
Well, some of the instruments are similar in some ways to what's on satellites. The Scanning His instrument is very similar to the AIRS instrument that's on the Aqua satellite, which basically gives you temperature and humidity profiles. The Cloud Physics LiDAR in the nose of the environmental aircraft is basically the same type of measurement as we get from a satellite called Calypso that gives profiles of dust and clouds. In terms of the Overstorm aircraft, the Doppler radar is sort of an advanced version of something that we'll see right now with our tropical rainfall measuring mission satellite that's been going for about more than 15 years now. It has the first and only rain or precipitation radar in space, but there's going to be a follow-on mission that launches next February called the Global Precipitation Measurement Mission, which will be a dual-frequency radar just getting precipitation profiles, not wind information from space, but the two frequencies on the GPM satellite are identical to what we have on the high-RAP Doppler radar. The other instruments are fairly unique and don't really necessarily have a space equivalent at this point.
Thank you, Scott. There are a couple of questions from Thierno Tall. One question is it possible to access the data about Hurricane Nadine? From a non-HS3 perspective, or actually even including an HS3 perspective, you can find Nadine under the NASA Hurricane page archives at nasa.gov/hurricane in the 2012 list of storms, where we do have a lot of the different NASA satellite data, as well as some of the information from when HS3 sent the Global Hawks over it. Scott, would you like to follow up with that?
Yeah, all the data is made freely available to the public. Anybody who wants to use it, if people go to our project webpage, which is espo.nasa.gov/HS3, there's a link on the left side that is for data, and it basically links you to archived web pages for each of the instruments that flew on the environmental aircraft last year. Of course, it takes some level of expertise to learn how to use these data sets, but for any researchers in particular who are interested in using these data, they can just go to those websites and download the data and start working with them. Typically, after data is collected while we're in the field, there's a period of about 6 months where the data is processed, quality controlled, and then once we make sure everything is all right, then we put the link on the web page so that it becomes available to anybody who wants to use it.
Okay. Thank you, Scott. The next question is about education materials on HS3 and hurricanes. For education materials on hurricanes in general, you can also go back to the NASA Hurricane page, nasa.gov/hurricane. There is an educators section there. I'm going to throw it to Marilyn Vasquez about the HS3.
Yes, thank you. I'm glad to be back. We do have materials. There's information on our website that Scott talked about. I think that's the best place. We also have links to information in our calendar about events that have to do with EPO or public affairs. So I would say the best place to start is our website.
Thank you, Marilyn. We have a question from Seth Bornstein of Associated Press, and this one involves operational data. Will the National Hurricane Center forecasters be able to use any of the data for their tracking models?
All right, well, from the environmental aircraft, the dropson data does get used. It's processed in real time by people at the NOAA Hurricane Research Division, and then they pass the information on to the National Hurricane Center. In addition, the data is uploaded to a global system for sharing the data, and so it's available not only for the Hurricane Center, but for operational forecast centers who might want to ingest that data into the forecast models. The other data, such as from the Cloud Physics LiDAR and Scanning HIS, are not as easy to use operationally, but we can make some of the data available in real time. I think they're going to be particularly interested in the data from our overstorm aircraft, and since this is our first year of flying the overstorm aircraft in the field, we have to see what we can do in terms of getting that data to them in real time. When you're trying to download large data sets from an aircraft down to the ground, we're limited by bandwidth, and it can be hard to get the information down quickly and with the sort of products that they want to see. So this year is sort of a test for us to produce certain types of products that we think would be useful for them, share that with them, maybe not necessarily in real time, but shortly after to get some feedback, and then hopefully by next year we can try to get the data to them in real time where it could help with their forecast operations. These are things that we're not required to do, but we certainly try to do on a best effort basis because we know that they can be beneficial, and so we're making every effort to do it. But again, you need to keep in mind that this is a fairly complex operation, a lot of things being done for the first time, and there's some kinks to be worked out in communicating such large data sets in real time.
All right, thank you, Scott. We have another question from Elizabeth Harbaugh. She actually would like you to elaborate on the Saharan air layer and why it may help hurricanes either intensify or it may help them fizzle out.
Okay, well, it helps to kind of keep in mind certain things that are needed for hurricanes to form and grow. One, you need to have fairly humid air to foster cloud development. Dry air tends to disrupt cloud development and even lead to cooling down near the surface in downdrafts. You also need the air to be fairly unstable, so where when it starts to rise, it wants to continue to rise to develop a deep thunderstorm. Whereas if the air becomes stable, it might tend to prevent that rising motion. And then also, hurricanes and developing tropical storms don't like what's called vertical wind shear. This is the change of winds with height, and that can have a shearing effect on the storms and basically rip them apart if the shear becomes too strong. So with the Saharan air layer, it's a very hot, dry, dusty air mass, and in that layer itself, that hot air overrides cooler air near the surface, so it tends to be very stable and it's hard to get deep cloud development. The dry air can potentially mix into storms and kind of cause them to lose some energy. And then on the southern side of the Saharan air layer, there tends to be a strong mid-level wind maximum or jet that can increase the vertical wind shear. So those are some of the arguments about why it may inhibit storm development just through increasing stability, bringing dry air in, and increasing vertical wind shear. Now, the arguments as for why it may have a positive influence on growth is a little bit more complex, but it has to do with the energetics of the large-scale wave in which the storm is embedded. And basically, the southern side of the SAL acts kind of like a front, and it may foster a vertical circulation that leads to rising motion south of that front, which is where you would typically get tropical cloud formation, and so it may enhance that. In addition, it may allow for conversions of energy from the larger scale down to the scale of the developing hurricane, a sort of large-scale dynamical instability that may favor growth. And it's a little bit hard to determine at this point whether the positive influences outweigh the negative influences, or if it may vary from case to case. So that's one of the things that we want to do, is get some data on these storms. These things are most prominent out in the central and eastern Atlantic, where we often don't get much data. So that's one of the motivations for us, is to get out to these storms much earlier and look at this interaction in a way that we haven't been able to do routinely in the past.
Okay, thank you, Scott. We have another question about the dropsons. The question is, are the small cylindrical tube sensors that you mentioned able to be recovered, or are they reused, or are they single use only?
No, they're single use only. They're basically falling to the surface. While they do have a GPS sensor in it to tell us their exact position, I don't believe that they float, or at least not for long, and they'd be pretty difficult to recover. So they're basically expendables that are used once, and that's it.
I do think the National Weather Service has a program where you can mail a dropson back, though, if it falls over land somewhere. But we're so far out at sea.
Yeah, we do not drop over land.
No. Thank you, Scott. Let's see. We have another question from Twitter, Julie Bookman. Before I get to that, just a reminder, we have about 12 minutes left on the Hangout. If you have any comments, you can ask your comments through YouTube or Twitter by hashtag NASA HS3, or you can ask them on the Google Plus page. So the next question from Julie Bookman, from Julie Bookman, right? How frequently does the dropson collect temperature data, and is dropson data used to verify or qualify temperature data collected by HAMSR?
All right, well, the data collected, I'm trying to remember what the number is. It's like 1 or 10 hertz. It's about 1 to 10 times per second, so very high resolution. So we get very, basically extreme vertical resolution, which is extremely helpful. The HAMSR, unfortunately, is on the other aircraft, so we're not able to verify the HAMSR profiles, although in one of our test flights in 2011, we flew Scanning His, HAMSR, and the dropsons together for 2 flights, and we were able to collect the data set that was used to verify the retrieval algorithm for HAMSR. Now, within our hurricane flights, Scanning His and dropson are on the same aircraft, and Scanning His also gets vertical profiles of temperature and humidity, primarily in the clear air. So we are able to use the dropson data to validate or verify the Scanning His information.
Okay, thank you, Scott. We're actually seeing a video of a flyover from the belly of the Global Hawk right now as it flew over Hurricane Carl in the eastern Pacific Ocean. And I think that was from the GRIP mission in 2010. There's another question that came through from Christopher Anderson, and Christopher wants to know, was the Global Hawk custom made by Lockheed, or was it repurposed from the Navy or Air Force version? I guess we can go over to maybe Tom or Scott, whoever wants to answer that.
Yeah, I could probably speak to that. This, like I mentioned earlier, this aircraft behind me was actually the technology demonstrator built by Northrop Grumman Ryan back in mid-90s, and it first flew in 1998. So these aircraft were accessed by the Air Force, and so we repurposed them. They are essentially what the Air Force had flown as their Block 10 aircraft. They have a larger version of it now that they're flying operationally. And NASA has actually obtained a couple more of those aircraft that we hope to use on future missions.
Thank you, Tom. We have one more question. It says, how many research planes will be flying during a hurricane at one time? Will both planes be flying, or will it just be one?
Well, we'll always be flying just one at a time. As part of HS3, we don't have the capability or manpower at the moment to fly both simultaneously. In terms of the number of aircraft that could be flying in the storm at any one time, it could be multiple aircraft. You could potentially have one of our Global Hawks, the NOAA P3 aircraft, which is sort of a low to mid-level flying aircraft. There's a NOAA Gulfstream 4 aircraft that flies at somewhat higher altitude. And then potentially Air Force aircraft out there as well. Back in 2010, during our GRIP campaign, our Genesis and Rapid Intensification Experiment, at one point we actually had, I think, 5 aircraft in the storm at one point. There was 3 NASA aircraft, 2 NOAA aircraft, and at various times an Air Force aircraft. So it is possible to have multiple aircraft operating at the same time.
Thank you, Scott. Before we get back to questions, I just want to identify the partners, because this is quite an immense effort of coming together. There are several NASA centers involved with HS3. Wallops Flight Facility is one center where the Global Hawks will be based. We have Ames Research Center. The Earth Science Project Office is located there, and they manage the project. Goddard Space Flight Center, the Dryden Research Center, where Tom Miller is broadcasting from, the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, and NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California. In addition to NASA, though, there are other outside partners that have contributed quite a bit to this mission. NOAA's Hurricane Research Division is a part of this mission, and the Earth System Research Laboratory. The National Centers for Environmental Prediction, the Naval Postgraduate School, the Naval Research Laboratory, Northrop Grumman, NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, State University of New York at Albany, University of Maryland, Baltimore County, University of Wisconsin, and the University of Utah. So as you can see, this is quite an effort that brings together all of these scientific organizations. Just a reminder before we get to the next question that all of these videos and images will be on the NASA HS3 website, nasa.gov/HS3. And we also have additional information on the nasa.gov/hurricane page. Okay, let's take another question. Let's see, from Twitter. Bear with me for just a moment. What was the deadliest storm of 2012? We'll throw that one over to Scott.
I don't have that information offhand. My focus last year was primarily while we were in the field. Superstorm Sandy was probably the deadliest, but I can't confirm that. It's certainly the most damaging, probably.
Brian, do you happen to do you want to add into that?
Yeah, I don't have that right on hand either, but I think that's correct. The only other storm of significance that made landfall was Isaac, and that did cause some issues too. But no, I don't have that right in front of me. It would be on the National Hurricane Center website, though. You can look up the previous years or any year's tropical cyclone reports, or TCRs they're called. So they can just look on the nhc.noaa.gov and look for the tropical cyclone reports.
Okay, thanks, Brian. One more question from YouTube. Do you stage locations overseas for other tropical cyclone areas besides the Atlantic?
For HS3, we're not. We're simply focused on the Atlantic. There is another Earth Venture suborbital project called HX, which expects to have one of their deployments out of Guam, I believe, this year, and Tom can probably speak more to that.
Yeah, that's correct, Scott. We plan to go to Guam early next year.
All right, thank you both. Brian, do you have any additional questions for the team?
No, I don't. This was a lot of very good questions asked by some other folks too.
Okay. Marilyn, Tom, and Scott, are there any other things that you want to mention that we did not bring up yet?
Can't think of anything.
Okay. So the first flight is August 20th, and that's departing Wallops.
That'll be the first potential science flight. Our operational window for science flights is August 20th to about September 23rd. Of course, whether or not we fly that particular day or any other particular day depends on whether targets are available. It depends on the weather at Wallops. Because we're an unmanned aircraft, we require a chase aircraft with pilots to act as the eyes of the pilots on the ground. So bad weather at Wallops would keep us grounded.
But the planes will actually transit the week of August 12th, so they will leave Dryden and land at Wallops at that time, and that's when they'll start their deployment ops.
Okay, and the peak of hurricane season is usually the first or second week of September?
It's around September 10th or so.
September 10th. So we're hoping for a number of cyclones, tropical cyclones out there to study. Nadine was very cooperative last year. Scott, how long did Nadine hang around last year?
I don't remember the exact number of days. I think it was on the order of about 24 to 28 days, something like that. I think it was the fifth longest storm on record. The odd thing about last year was it was a very active season. Obviously we got all the way up at least through S on the list of names, and yet during the 5 weeks we were in the field, we really only had a couple of storms occur. Fortunately for us, Nadine stuck around for a long time and provided some very useful information. It was a storm that, by all rights, should have died much earlier than it did, and yet it somehow kept going, and we collected some very interesting data that I think will tell us a little bit about how it was able to maintain itself and then eventually redevelop.
And this is another case where the capability of the airplane is really important, because we were able to go all the way over to the Azores and spend time in Nadine. So that's that long-range capability.
Thank you both. And again, for anyone who wants more information on how NASA covered Hurricane Nadine over the long course of life that it had, go to nasa.gov/hurricane and click on the 2012 archive, and you'll see information from the different NASA satellites as well as some of the HS3 input in there. Well, that concludes our Google Hangout, and I just want to remind everybody that this video will be archived on the NASA Goddard YouTube channel, which is NASA Explorer. For more information, you can go to the HS3 website, which is nasa.gov/HS3. And again, all of the videos that you saw playing during this Google Hangout and the images will also be posted up there. From NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, I'm Rob Guttrow, and I thank you very much for watching.